morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Subscriber Participating Transmission Owner Model meeting to discuss the revised draft final proposal. My name is Caitlin McGee. I'm representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by Deb Levine, Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found on the California ISO's website under the Stay Informed tab and then the Policy Initiatives webpage. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started today. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We really try to structure these meetings in a way to stimulate dialogue, engage different perspectives, but we also do ask that you please keep comments professional and respectful and to try to refrain from repeating what has already been said. Next slide, please. There's a few ways to answer or ask a question and ask some comments today. The coffee's still kicking in today. If you are connected to audio through your computer using the Call Me option, you can select the raise hand icon in the lower right, just above the chat window. That'll put you in the queue and we'll call on you to ask your question or make your comment. You can also drop your comment or question into the chat and I'll read it aloud for you. And then if you're connected through the audio only line, you can press #2 and that'll add you to the queue. When you are asking your question or stating your comment, please remember to state your name and affiliation beforehand. If you do need any technical assistance during the meeting today, you can send a chat to the event producer or to all panelists. Next slide, please. And then here's just a quick graphic of the California ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. As I mentioned, today we're here to discuss the revised draft final proposal, and you can see on this graphic that we're closer to the end of the proposal development process. Next slide. So with that, I'll hand it over to Deb.
All right, thanks so much, Caitlin, appreciate it. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's stakeholder initiative on the subscriber PTO model. The topics we're going to go through today, we're going to go through the whole proposal. So development of the model, the use of encumbrances, the different components of the transmission charge, including the subscriber wheeling charge, future network upgrades, and what happens at the termination of the subscriber encumbrance. Then we'll go through the transmission cost allocation, generator interconnection process, transmission planning process, and deliverability. Next slide, please. So actually the only changes from the draft final proposal to the revised draft final proposal are in essence three. One is that we've gone ahead and based on suggestions from stakeholders from the draft final proposal, we've capped the subscriber wheeling charge at no greater than the TAC or the WAC. Sorry, transmission access charge and wheeling access charge. You get so used to using acronyms at the ISO, I apologize. So that's the first change. The second change is that we had a much more in-depth conversation with our transmission planners and the generator interconnection team that goes ahead and does all the studies associated with anything that wants to interconnect to the grid, whether it's a transmission line interconnecting, a generation interconnecting, another balancing authority area wants to interconnect to us. And what came out of that discussion was that the study process we had originally proposed was not the correct study process given everything that the subscriber participating transmission owner has to go through, even just to get to interconnecting to the ISO grid. So what we've done is we've gone ahead and realigned the study process with factually what the participating TO has to do. which in essence is go to each one of the interconnection points, whether they're within the CAISO BA or outside of the CAISO BA, and do the study process associated with the interconnection with other BAs along with the CAISO BA. And our process to interconnect a new transmission line that's coming in from outside of the CAISO BA is to run it through both the deliverability and reliability studies, and it goes ahead and in order to actually do the study, they have to incorporate both the generation and the transmission components. That's the only way to really study the flow, the correct flow on the line, along with integrating it into different balancing authority areas to the extent that they're going to be touching different balancing authority areas. So given that change in how the studies are actually being done, and we didn't see a reason to have them go through the study process twice, the subscriber PTO will have the first right of refusal to the capacity upgrades included in the portfolio. So as an example, the portfolios that we have for from the CPUC for the 23-24 transmission planning process include 1,500 megawatts from Wyoming or Idaho. So it'll end up that Transwest Express, who has already started the process, will have the first right of refusal to that capacity as far as deliverability is concerned. And to the extent, if it's a period of time where the TPP does not identify anything in the portfolio upgrades, then the project will go through the deliverability process that is part of the generator, the last step in the generator interconnection process. So that is one of the larger changes, I would say, that we're making in the revised draft final as compared to the draft final proposal. And then the other change is that because the subscriber PTO transmission and generation doesn't get added into the TPP until the line has determined it's going to move forward and a generator interconnection agreement has been executed for those transmission facilities. That's what the rules and the process are for adding something to the transmission planning process today. It'll end up that no non-subscriber generators will be allowed to interconnect into the subscriber PTO until we get that notification that the line is going to be built. So those are the three changes. And as I said, it's mostly resulting from comments from subscribers, comments from stakeholders from the draft final, along with a more in-depth discussion with the various, actually, PTOs within the CAISO Balancing Authority area as to what studies are currently being done versus what studies need to be done in the future. So with that, all of these will be rediscussed when I get to that section. So I'm going to wait and hold questions until we get there. So next slide, please. So just to remind everybody, the development of a model, the subscriber PTO model, is in essence to support development of out-of-state resources that are not going to be in the ISO's transmission revenue requirements, but it's going to allow the ISO to meet demand that we see coming in the future with both the increase in renewables to meet our renewable portfolio standard, along with the high electrification requirements that we have for the future. So with that, the CPUC is starting to add to our portfolios that we're getting from them a significant increase in generation, both in-state and out-of-state. And so we're looking to partner with entities who are willing to build transmission lines from outside of the state with generation attached that would go ahead and be able to, be able to not increase our transmission revenue requirement for the transmission access charge and wheeling access charge. In addition, the other big issue that the ISO is trying to avoid is the propagation of generation-only balancing authority areas. We found with the generation-only balancing authority areas, the reliability of the West is challenged. I would not say compromised, but it's challenged with gen-only BAs. And by allowing these entities to be part of the ISO balancing authority area, it allows the line and the generation to go ahead and meet the needs of the load serving entities within California. We also look at this as a more flexible model to allow the load serving entities the opportunity to determine what's going to meet their renewable portfolio requirements. And what other, each one of the, the state has its policy procurement requirements, but so doesn't each one of the municipal utilities, the irrigation districts. Some of them have their own requirements that their boards are trying to meet. So it allows that flexibility for everyone to make their own choices instead of going ahead and having the ISO incorporate these large transmission lines within our transmission revenue requirements to meet the portfolio standards for the future. Any questions on why we're developing the subscriber PTO model?
Currently no questions.
Go ahead, Melissa. Michelle, go ahead.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Perfect, thank you. Next slide, please. So for the use of encumbrances, the comments we got back from the draft final proposal was that a number of stakeholders support the use of encumbrances. Some of the stakeholders requested specific examples of how an encumbrance would work, how a non-subscriber transaction would work, and how the subscriber wheeling charge is determined, how it's charged, and then how it's paid. So I did add an appendix onto the revised draft final proposal, and hopefully those examples are sufficient. I had reached out to a couple of you to see if you wanted additional understanding or wanted me to walk through those examples, which I'm happy to do separately, but I didn't want to go through the examples during this meeting. But if you do have questions, please just give me a call and I'm happy to walk through them with you. And then one stakeholder still prefers the use of CRRs versus using encumbrances. Next slide, please. So the rationale for using the encumbrance for the subscriber rights is numerous, actually. One is that the software already exists in our system. The processes within our various departments that have to touch existing contracts, all those processes have been in place for a number of years. They're well oiled, and there would be no new functionality that would have to be created in order to use the existing encumbrance functionality that we have for the subscriber rights. Given that they're paying for the transmission line, giving them the perfect hedge, which means they are not charged for transmission or congestion, certainly makes sense, along with giving them the scheduling priority. I mean, they've paid for the line, they've built the line to come to the ISO so that the generation can serve most likely load serving entities within the CAISO balancing authority area. So it's only fair for them to go ahead and have the perfect hedge and the scheduling priority, which is a functionality that we already have. Encumbrances will be given contract reference numbers to ensure proper settlements. And in the case of, for Transwest Express, since their line is only coming from Wyoming into, in essence, the Nevada area, the contract reference number and the ability to get the scheduling priority and the perfect hedge stops at, in essence, the loop-in of the Harry Allen El Dorado line. And from there across the basin, they will go ahead and have to pay all charges just like anybody else who has an import at Harry Allen or El Dorado. So they're paying the same charges that anybody else would have, except for to the extent of the lines that they've gone ahead and built. And this, after the explanation from Edison, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate your thinking on that. Our thought is, though, that the CRR only hedges for congestion, and it doesn't provide a mechanism to give them the scheduling priority, nor do the correct settlement statements for zeroing out their transmission access charge, which they would end up having to pay for that portion of the line. So that's in essence the rationale for using the subscriber rights. If I could go on to the next slide. So just to summarize, we're not proposing to change the use of encumbrances for subscriber rights that was in the draft final proposal. The functionality already exists. It gives them the scheduling priority and it gives them the correct settlements. So with that, if anyone has any questions, if you could please raise your hand, and I'm happy to take questions.
I do have a few questions in the chat, and I can read those off for you. The first one is from Brian Millard from NextEra Energy Resources, and he's asking, can the CAISO confirm that the right of first refusal applies to the deliverability associated with the upgrades, not the transmission build?
That's correct. Deliverability is for the generator interconnection process of it. Although I'll talk about more in the future slides.
We do have two questions from Chris Devon from CES. The first one, can you explain why gen-only BAAs cause reliability challenges?
Certainly. So the reliability challenges that a gen-only BAA, in essence, results in is if the generator goes down and it's selling to the CAISO, typically while they're providing their own ancillary services, if the transmission line is down, then in essence, the ability to interconnect to the grid is completely gone. So all of a sudden, we could be getting a couple of thousand megawatts from a gen-only BA, and all of a sudden that couple of thousand megawatts disappears, either because of the generator tripping or the loss of the transmission. And so what we've been finding with the generation-only BAs is that we go ahead and have to have additional regulation available. It's gotten above our most single contingents because of the substantial generation we get from generation-only BAs. The other thing that we see is that with that large of a loss from a gen-only BA, there are the potentials for faults across the system because of the large loss, and being, 80% of the load in California, and I think we're 60% of the load in the WECC, we typically end up feeling the impact of the generation-only BAs and any issues they have on their systems.
All right, and I think this speaks to his second question a bit, but he did send in the chat, does the SPTO model cause possible reliability challenges for other BAAs if the CAISO market is dispatching generation that is physically located embedded long distances away in other BAAs?
No, there's a number of balancing authority areas. I mean, if you'll recall, originally the ISO balancing authority area got generation all the way from Four Corners with the Edison's entitlement rights to Four Corners, plus a number of utilities had rights to Navajo. The LA Department of Water and Power balancing authority area actually goes all the way up into Utah and incorporates the Intermountain Power Project. So there are a number of balancing authority areas that have generation that are far away from their load source, but by having it all incorporated in the one balancing authority area, when you do your area control error calculation, you can account for all that generation, and it ends up the broader that your balancing authority area is, the better off you can go ahead and balance the needs of the balancing authority area. And Chris, did that answer your question?
Yes, he says both explanations are very helpful.
You're welcome. Do we not have the hand raise function working?
We do. So Chris, if you do want to say something as a follow-up, you can, there you go, raise your hand.
Okay. I just hadn't gotten any raised hands yet, and I was thinking that the functionality didn't work. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
No, sorry. I appreciate the explanations. That's very helpful. It just, they kind of came up as you were moving through the slides, so I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the presentation. But I do actually wanted to maybe make another question, just a more general question about like how the whole process would work with the encumbrances and the whole thing with LAWP and these contract reference numbers and such with EDAM, that I think is kind of outside the normal slides here from what I could see. So just, so first off, thank you very much for both those other explanations. That made a lot of sense to me on the you know, the whole gen only BAA thing and having to have more than the most severe single contingency reg holding that and all those things. So that's great. And then I didn't quite know about all those other existing, you know, longer transmission lines that go out, or, you know, encumbrances that use those far distance. That was just something I was kind of wanting to try to understand, because it's a little bit different than like a pseudo tie, but it does make sense that, you know, if you guys are kind of coordinating the whole balancing of that BAA, it's probably more reliable than if you were just, you know, having one you know, transmission line being, you know, potentially linking up some generation or something. So anyway, so thank you for those. But let me just try to get this out quickly here for just my understanding on the use of these, you know, transmission lines under, like, let's say Transwest Express project, because it has like 1,500 megawatts coming to CAISO and 1,500 megawatts coming to, you know, LADWP. In the future, when it's under EDAM, the use of these contract reference numbers, they would the CAISO market and EDAM still be dispatching that generation like that's going to LADWP if, for instance, they were to join as an EDAM BAA, and then would the CAISO market be able to use, you know, up to that 3,000 megawatt total capacity, or would it kind of only be using the 1,500 megawatts? Like if, for instance, you know, there wasn't some of that wind up there, you know, that was producing, maybe the whole project was only producing 1,000 megawatts of the 3,000 megawatts, then could the EDAM market use other generation and kind of fill up that line all the way up to 3,000 megawatts if, for instance, they were an EDAM participating BAA as well? Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. So to the extent that the wind generation isn't fully using the line, so in other words, the subscribers are not fully using the line because there's insufficient generation, then the line is available for use by non-subscribers, and that's who's going to pay the subscriber wheeling charge. To the extent that LA purchases 1,500 megawatts of the wind generation up there, they'll be given a contract reference number that in essence goes from the Wyoming interconnection of the generation down to the Utah substation. And at the Utah substation, there'll be an export. So they'll, in essence, be gen inside the CAISO Balancing Authority area with a contract reference number that gives them the perfect hedge and the special settlements to get out of the CAISO Balancing Authority area at the Utah substation. The additional 1,500 megawatts will come through Nevada down to the ISO. So if either, you know, the portion going to LA or the portion going to the ISO, in your example, if there's only 1,000 megawatts out of the 3,000 megawatts, and let's say 500 megawatts is going to LA and 500 megawatts is going to CAISO, all the way down to the new substation looping into the Harry Allen El Dorado line, then in essence, the additional 1,000 megawatts would be available for non-subscribers or subscribers to use that portion of the line.
Okay, I think I understand. So yeah, that all makes sense to me. And then the additional, like, let's say if it's the 3,000 megawatts and there was that other 1,500 that was kind of secured by LADWP, if they were a EDAM entity, then would they still be able to kind of schedule that, or would the EDAM market, if they donated it, maybe if it wasn't, you know, let's say their day ahead wind forecast was pretty low, and then they said, well, let's just donate that to EDAM use. Then the EDAM market could use it, but it would be kind of outside the CAISO normal, like internal market use versus like an EDAM transfer kind of. I'm just trying to understand how it might work under EDAM with this extra capacity on that line if they were a EDAM participant. Maybe it's a confusing question. I apologize if it is, but I think I understand where you're going on the general 1,500 megawatts, but I'm just kind of curious as to the extra 1,500. That whole line could be, filled up completely potentially by like market transfers, be it internal CAISO market transfers. I think that would be capped at the 1,500, but then the other 1,500 potentially could be like an EDAM transfer that the EDAM market would optimize if they had donated it for EDAM use. Is that correct?
Hey, Deb, I think I can, unless you want to go ahead.
No, I was going to say, John, I saw you take your phone off mute, and I hope you know the answer.
Well, I think I understand the question, and if LA is an EDAM participant, so their balancing area is in EDAM, then they would have these 1,500 megawatts of rights, and that would go across the intertie at whatever it is,
Utah.
or Utah, and so they could, under the proposal, make those that additional capacity available to the extent it wasn't being used to deliver wind. They could make that available to the EDAM market, so the day-ahead market for EDAM transfers between the CAISO balancing area and the LA balancing area at that location. And then if there were, according to the EDAM rules, if there were the price differences gave rise to transfer revenue, that would then be recoverable revenue for the LA balancing area, I believe, and it gets shared 50-50. But since they have rights on both sides, I think they collect both sides of that transaction.
Okay, very, very helpful. Yeah, I just wanted to, I think that lines up with my understanding of how the whole EDAM, proposal would work, and this is just a kind of unique situation I was a little bit curious about. So thank you for answering the questions, and that was very helpful. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, not seeing any other hands raised. Why don't we go to the next slide? So with the subscriber wheeling charge and the project transmission costs, the project will not include any costs in the transmission revenue requirement for either the TAC or the WAC. But the subscriber PTO will develop a subscriber wheeling charge that allows them to go ahead and charge non-subscribers. So people who have not paid for the line are going to have to pay for the use of the subscriber PTO line, which is consistent with the FERC, subscriber-funded transmission, along with cost causation principles. So the subscriber itself is going to have to go ahead and self-schedule their rights in the market. And if they don't self-schedule their rights, then in essence, the balance of the transmission will be available for market use by non-subscribers. And then the cost recovery of the subscriber charge is going to be included as part of the calculation of the monthly disbursement of transmission revenue requirements. As I said earlier, one of the changes that we are making is to go ahead and incorporate in that the subscriber wheeling charge can be no greater than the transmission access charge or the wheeling access charge. Next slide, please. So there is a slight proposal difference, and it's more after talking to settlements, how the easiest way to go ahead and ensure that the subscriber wheeling charge is paid by the non-subscribers. The sequence of events, it turns out, is going to change a little bit. Originally, the way it had been set up is that the subscriber wheeling charge would be calculated and then taken off the top of all of the billing revenue received for the overall access charge. Instead, what's going to make more sense to settlements is to go ahead and determine what the subscriber wheeling charge is based on the total usage by non-subscribers on their path. And then we'll go ahead and first allocate all of the wheeling revenue to the amount of subscriber charge that's going to be collected on the scheduling points that are going to be part of the new subscriber transmission. So in the case of Transwest Express, there'll be a new import point at Ferris. There'll be, a new scheduling point at Ferris, a new scheduling point at Utah, a new scheduling point at TWE Crystal. So there's 3 new scheduling points that will, in essence, get revenue for all exports that go out at those 3 points. So we'll use that revenue first to pay the subscriber wheeling charge for the month. And then if the charge is insufficient, or if the revenue is insufficient from the wheeling access charge revenue, then we'll go ahead and, similar to what we already do for non-load serving participating TOs, is we go ahead and allocate the next stage of the revenue gets allocated to all of the entities that are not serving load. And so they would be allocated in that stage of the disbursement of funds. And then the balance of the monthly is called billed RAC, which is the regional access charge. So all that revenue is then allocated across pro rata to the PTOs that are load serving entities. And we will, as we've said earlier, go ahead and memorialize the original build costs to ensure that such costs never gets into the transmission revenue requirements of the ISO's access charge. Next slide, please. With respect to network upgrades beyond the original build, so as an example, it's a subscriber PTO is chosen by the ISO to build another line, upgrade their line as part of the TPP, or as part of the generator interconnection process, additional generators want to interconnect to their line, then all of that will be subject to a transmission revenue requirement and the subscriber PTO will have to go to FERC, similar to our other participating TOs, get a cost of service rate that then will be included as part of the non-load serving PTOs. And then I'd like to go, I see a couple of hands raised, but let me just go ahead and get through this section with respect to the costs of the transmission and the upgrades. And then I'll take questions when we get to the summary slide. So next slide, please. And then with termination of the subscriber encumbrances, we're not proposing to change anything there. So it's up to the subscriber, it's up to the subscriber PTO to have sufficient encumbrances in order to pay for the original build cost of the transmission line. Everyone, all of the stakeholders strongly supported that. And then once the original project has been completely paid off, since that's going to be well past, you know, probably most of our time with the ISO 30 or 50 years from now, whatever the regulatory requirements are in place at that point in time will need to be determined what happens with the encumbrances and the future costs, to the extent that there are any, of the subscriber PTO line. And with that, next slide, please. So in summary, the subscriber wheeling charge, the change is that it's going to be capped at the WAC or the TAC rates. The new network upgrades are not going to change at all. And the termination of the subscriber encumbrances are also not going to change. Once the subscriber encumbrance is completed, and the project has obtained all the revenue for their original build, including, you know, we'll also go ahead and incorporate in the depreciation schedule for the line. And once the original project has been completely paid off, then in essence, continuing the encumbrance and/or how it's going to be incorporated into the grid will be based on the applicable regulatory requirements at that time. So with that, I see Bert Hansen's hand is raised. If you could open up Bert's line. Go ahead, Bert. Yep.
My question is on the subscriber wheeling charge. And of course, we're appreciative of the proposal to cap the SWAC at the ISOs, so that theoretically would not allow any leaking of the SPTO cost into the TAC. That's our main concern, to keep the cost, at least of the original build, outside of the TAC. And so I think we're still a little bit concerned that when it goes to FERC to determine what the wheeling access charge would be, that might be a 0, in which case a lot of this would be moot. But if it wasn't 0, and in the case of where it was actually larger than the ISO's TAC rate, that FERC might not approve such a capping. And so our alternative proposal that we had put forth a couple of proposals ago was basically to, instead of having a determinative WAC rate for the SPTO, to compensate them for their facilities for the non-subscriber usage using essentially CRR revenue. That would give them a share of revenue, and it, in our opinion, would not be raise issues at FERC. And basically our main concern is just keeping the costs out of TAC. And so that's our proposal that we think would achieve all the objectives and be approved by FERC more likely.
So as I put in the revised draft final proposal, ISO thanks Edison very much for its thoughtfulness on this issue. But the CRR revenue that is going to be collected on the subscriber PTO transmission facilities is going to be used to pay the congestion charges associated with the subscriber's use of the line. So that was our main concern with giving the subscriber wheeling revenue, because they're not going to get anything, because that's how we go ahead and make the market whole as far as giving the subscriber the perfect hedge for congestion costs going from all the way from Wyoming substation down to the loop in of the Harry Allen El Dorado line. With regard to your concern with the FERC process, the ISO is going to put in the tariff, and we will justify in our filing why we believe it's appropriate to go ahead and cap the subscriber wheeling charge. But FERC can do what FERC is going to do, but we are definitely committed to go ahead and put that in as the ISO's filing of how this whole entire process would work and the implications associated with not capping it, and the impact to the other PTOs. So we'll include that in our filing.
Okay. On the CRR issue, is a lot of this revenue that would be associated with non-subscriber usage, would that be essentially exiting in the opposite direction of what the subscribers would be going, which is north to south? And so the CRRs, or the perfect hedge that would be provided through the encumbrance, I'm not sure that that would be taken up by any of the non-subscriber CRRs, because they have the first priority north to south, of course. Or am I not looking at that right?
You're correct that to the extent that the subscribers are going north to south, the CRR revenue associated with congestion north to south is going to be taken up by the subscribers. If there is any congestion going south to north, what ends up actually happening is that in the CRR model, since they paid for the line, they actually have rights going south to north and north to south. So the subscriber has it fully encumbered, and the line is going to go ahead and be taken out of the CRR model. So it's not even going to be available for load serving entities to get CRRs and or incorporated into the auction. That's how the CRR process works. It takes out all of the encumbered lines to begin with, and then goes ahead and only deals with lines that have no encumbrances or entitlements on it.
Okay, that's interesting. I thought I remembered that the subscribers are only subscribing north to south, or are you saying that they're subscribing north to south and south to north?
At the moment, the subscriber PTO has the ability to subscribe south to north and north to south.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking of TWE in particular.
Well, they still have as a subscriber PTO, they still have an ability to get a contract to subscribe south to north and north to south. I believe that the public company of Wyoming is only subscribing from north to south, but that doesn't preclude Transwest Express from getting a subscriber that wants to go south to north.
Okay,
So
thanks.
work.
Okay, that's my question. Thanks.
Sure. Next question is from Chris Devon.
Hey again, Chris here. Thanks for the opportunity on this one. I guess I wanted to kind of just ask a more general question about the whole non-contiguous BAA thing, and then it's kind of related to the rate piece of it as well. So from my reading, I think you guys still had it in there in the proposal, but could you confirm that's still going to go forward as part of the proposal? The non-contiguous BAA concept as a subscriber PTO option?
Yes. It's very similar to what we already do today with getting entitlement rights from our participating TOs. So as an example, 6 cities, a lot of the 6 cities have rights on the Meade Phoenix, Meade Adelanto line, which in essence is in APS's balancing authority area and then LADWP's balancing authority area. And so we have those entitlement rights. Those rights have been used in our market. And it's been working for 20, how many years have I been at the ISO? 25 years, 26 years. So it would be the same thing as that, that we already do for entitlement rights.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation. I really appreciate the education and some of these examples that I'm not aware of exactly how it's actually working in operation. So thank you for the history there, Deb. And you know, I guess so. The part that I was reading in the actual proposal, you know, on that section, kind of on page 25 and 26, is you know, explaining that it's, you know, basically it's not electrically connected, but then, or it's non-contiguous, but it is actually electrically contiguous when you add in those encumbrances, right? So that's the concept. So basically, that you answered my question with your response there already, I think, which was I was trying to understand if it's going to be in the market. So basically, the market would use that encumbrance right and say, okay, we can connect it into the CAISO BAA here, and it is really electrically contiguous because you're using it similar to like those Meade rights that you were just explaining that you use from 6 cities.
Correct.
Okay, very good. And then as far as just the rate piece of it goes, you know, I think my understanding is that you would still be able to, you know, dispatch a non-subscriber on that line, but they would just pay that, you know, subscriber wheeling charge piece or whatever as part of the rate structure if it was a market-based dispatch and not a subscriber use. Is that fair to say too?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. That was what I was hoping to hear. So that confirms what my understanding from the reading of it was. So thank you for the explanation. That's it. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks so much. Could you open up a Sharon's line, please?
Hey, this is Sharon Segner from LS Power, and just got a quick question on the cost allocation side. And I'm curious, in this proposal, is there any percentage of regional cost allocation that could be triggered by this proposal?
I'm sorry, could you state the question again?
Yeah, is there any percentage of the project cost that could trigger regional cost allocation from the proposal?
So the proposal does not include any cost in the transmission revenue requirement. But they will get revenue through the subscriber wheeling charge for the non-subscriber use of their transmission facilities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so the revenue would be paid for from the non-subscriber use of the transmission facilities. And is that revenue for that use come from several transmission zones or 2 or more transmission zones?
Well, the revenue is going to come from 2 areas. One is the wheeling access charge based on the new scheduling points that the subscriber PTO is going to go ahead and add to the ISO Balancing Authority area, since it's in the ISO Balancing Authority area. And if that revenue for those in Transwest Express case is 3 different scheduling points, if that revenue is insufficient to meet the non-subscriber use of their transmission facility, then they would be paid the same as the non-load serving entities, non-load serving participating TOs using the billed regional access charge revenue for the month. And that's consistent with Appendix Appendix F, Schedule 3, Section, I think it's 13 of that schedule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I'm just really trying to understand, at the end of the day, is there potential for the cost of these transmission facilities to be paid for by 2 or more zones?
By 2 or more what?
2 or more zones.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble understanding you. 2 or more
Transmission owner zones.
No, the access charge is paid for by loads and exports. And you might want to look at scenario 4 in the Appendix A to the revised draft final. I tried to go through how the subscriber wheeling charge is determined and then what the disbursement process would be for it.
Great. I'll take a look. Thank you.
Sure. And Michelle, could you open up Terry Havek's line?
Hey, Deb. Thank you for all the explanation. I had 2 questions, one of which I think might be for John, but the question was regarding earning of congestion revenues and referring to, I think, page 18 of the proposal, but then following up on the conversation with the gentleman prior about CRRs. So if I'm recapping that, because the subscriber SPTO model is never going to be in the CRR model, I think I've concluded that based on your comment, regardless of whether the line is fully subscribed south to north, it's never going to be in the CRR model. So I guess the question is going to clarify the exchange that you had on page 18 is, why, if the line is paid for by the subscribers to the line, do any congestion revenues get kicked back to load in that instance? If the line is never in the CRR model and therefore no compensation optionality for the transmission owner. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding it wrapped around the axle of CRRs.
It's okay. CRRs wrap me around the axle too. Because I was working on them when they were FTRs,
Yep.
and they've changed a few times.
Yep, I was back there with you, Deb.
So what I got from the congestion revenue rights people is that all the existing contracts, encumbrances, and entitlements of TRR rights, all of those rights are in essence pulled out of the CRR model.
Yep.
So that's not available. And then they changed like 2 years ago or 3 years ago that there's no longer a balancing account for CRRs. And so to the extent that there's typically there's a insufficient revenue, and so those congestion revenues get taken out of what gets collected from the shortfall. Everybody gets a pro rata reduction, so they don't have that balancing account anymore. And since the CRRs are given to the load serving entities first before there's any auction right, then when it's auctioned, it's only to the extent that the CRR is auctioned would another entity who's not a load serving entity be allowed to get CRRs, and then those CRRs, they would get the revenue, but if the revenue is short that month, then they get the haircut just like everybody else does.
Okay, so I think the question there is, if a subscriber-based line is not in the CRR model for all the reasons you just discussed, therefore the CRR crediting back to LSCs would be inoperable here. What would be the reason that the TransWest subscriber or the transmission owner in this instant wouldn't be the entity that is paid the congestion, whether it's an EDAM or the day-ahead market for resolving congestion? Because in this instance, load never paid for the line. There's no CRRs to provide a revenue stream to the subscribers in TransWest for all the reasons we described. Doesn't it seem like either the subscribers probably in this instance should be the entities receiving the revenue stream from congestion, since CRRs do not apply?
So what ends up happening is there'll be an LMP at Wyoming, and there'll be an LMP at the new substation. We'll have a P node there so that we know what the congestion is across that path. And in that instance, what will happen is that all the revenue associated with that congestion is used to pay for the perfect hedge that the subscriber gets.
Okay, that
because you're still going to have a difference in P node prices.
Yep. Okay, that's actually, I'm taking notes. Okay, I think that answers my question, at least gives me something to think about. My second question is for
Noodle
John,
on?
maybe. What?
Noodle on?
Noodle on, I'm noodling, Deb. Hey, John, my second question is under the revised proposal that the subscriber-based transmission wouldn't have to go through both the interconnection process and the transmission to transmission owner study process. Is there any backtracking or FERC related or ISO agreement related type stuff? I know we've been in the stakeholder process for quite a while. Is there any backtracking that needs to happen because of that change?
So I don't think so. We're essentially trying to bring together two, things that were happening somewhat in parallel, but were sort of disconnected. One was in the TPP and one's in this policy initiative. And so this is the bridge, and it would be, reflected in the tariff as part of the subscriber PTO proposal, not in sort of a TPP like arena, but we haven't sorted through all the sections of the tariff that might be associated with that kind of a change, whether they're in the interconnection, the transmission planning, sections 24, 25, or are they, is it sufficient to just capture it and maybe with some cross-reference or something like that. Yeah, we still need to get to that level, but yeah, that's what we're doing. So that's the bridge, the connection. So yeah, does that help?
Yeah, it does. I think that's a tariff answer, and that makes sense. I was thinking more in terms of the agreements, like the participating the TCA, whatever that stands for, and the PTO agreements and the ones that have been filed at FERC and all that. Did that assume the
Sure.
interconnection process or reference it? And is there any backtracking there, or is that all separate and isolated?
So we haven't identified any backtracking. The only agreement we have with Transwest is the applicant PTO agreement,
Yeah.
which sort of fills the gap between their application and the project development.
Yep.
And so we don't see anything, there, and so we will be amending the TCA at some, point. And, this stakeholder initiative means the majority of those changes will be in the tariff, but
Yep.
there may be some conforming changes in the TCA. But the
Yeah.
TCA, it defers to the tariff for generator interconnections. And then, we don't think there's anything more on transmission interconnection that needs to be addressed in there, but we'll get there, and we're working our way through that as this progresses.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, Michelle, can you open up Chris Barker's line, please?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hey, Deb, Chris Parker with Clearway. Can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So I have a follow-up question on the non-contiguous BA or SPTO proposal. What I understand now is both for the contiguous and the non-contiguous SPTO, there will be a right of first refusal for the SPTO resource to get access to that deliverable capacity for those new generating resources. In the context of the non-contiguous, for subsequent generators that seek to interconnect to that non-contiguous SPTO, what is the process for getting those resources through the deliverability process? And I think more specifically to my question, if you have a transmission service agreement that connects the non-contiguous BAA with the CAISO BAA, and there is sufficient capacity at that interface for deliverability allocation, what is the requirement for the subsequent new generator that is seeking deliverability in that non-contiguous BA?
So the subsequent, well, let me back you up a second. So they only have the first right of refusal to the extent that the CPUC portfolio establishes a need for the transmission project that's coming in as an SPTO. So that's step one.
Yeah.
When the SPTO applies, if there isn't, as part of the process of applying and getting approval, everything in place, if there isn't a CPUC portfolio, then they would have to go ahead and get deliverability through their in essence, for a non-contiguous SPTO, they'd have to get deliverability by gathering up MIC and having sufficient MIC to offset what the interconnection is going to be into the CAISO BA. And MIC is market import capability.
Okay, so that would also apply to subsequent resources that are seeking to deliver across the non-contiguous kind of TSA. They would have to show up with MIC capacity for that incremental capacity?
Correct.
Okay, so those additional subsequent resources would not go through the GitApp in the same kind of standard process for allocation?
It would go through the generator interconnection process. The TPD deliverability piece would be done differently.
Got it.
Because they need to get MIC instead of being allocated deliverability.
Okay, yeah, that helps clarify. Thank you.
All right, we do have a question in the chat from Chris Devon. Is it correct that there would still be south to north CRRs issued on TWE if there is not a subscriber in the south to north direction?
If there is not a subscriber in the south to north direction, then yes.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Michelle, are there any audio-only questions?
No, there are currently no audio-only questions.
All right, fabulous. Next slide, please. So moving on to generator interconnections, I think we've killed this one a few times already, but I'll go through it again. Based on the further discussions with the transmission engineers and the participating transmission owners, the interconnection process for the original generation and transmission will be studied as part of the transmission interconnection process. And so they'll go through the TPP and get their deliverability to the extent that there is deliverability as part of the portfolio for the TPP. Excuse me. And existing PTOs will recover costs associated with network upgrades on their system through the TRR. And if it's part of the TPP portfolio, if there are additional network upgrades that are required that are not part of the portfolio, then in essence, it would be upfront financed by the generator and reimbursed by the participating TO. The subscriber PTO will not develop a TRR for the original build of the project, but to the extent that there are additional generation that ends up being, wants to interconnect to their facilities to the extent there's room, or upgrades are available to be built on it, then they will develop a transmission revenue requirement for that only that portion that is needed for the additional interconnection. Any questions on generator interconnection and how the SPTO is going to be studied? Okay, next slide. Okay. So again, here, the SPTO is going to be added to the TPP once the subscriber PTO has executed the applicant participating TO agreement and the subscriber has executed the generator interconnection agreement. It turns out in talking to the planners, that's when all of the transmission that has been identified in a generator interconnection process, it doesn't get added into the TPP until the GIA is executed and the project is moving forward. So we're going to use the exact same structure for adding the SPTO transmission facilities into the TPP. And then with deliverability, there's no change there. The MIC will be added at the new import points. MIC at existing import points has priority over future interconnections. MIC is allocated, which somebody, thank you very much, maximum import capability. I always want to call it market import capability. That's putting my old market services hat on. So maximum import capability is allocated to load serving entities. It's not located to the participating TOs. And if the subscriber is within the balancing authority area, it does not need maximum import capability in order for its generation to flow within the ISO-BA. Next slide, please. So in review, the ISO revised draft final proposal, we will provide the subscriber PTO subscribers with encumbrance rights. We will charge all load, the tax, and all exports the WAC. So there's no rate pancaking. The subscriber PTO will be paid by non-subscriber use of their transmission facilities. Costs of the original build will be documented and not included in the ISO's transmission revenue requirements. If the subscriber encumbrance is terminated prior to the original build cost, it'll be up to the subscriber PTO to pay for those continuing costs, get another subscriber or someone else, because they're not going to be recovered through the ISO transmission revenue requirements. Next slide, please. The project will be studied as part of the transmission interconnection process, which in essence is then fed into the transmission planning process. Future interconnections will be treated in accordance with the tariff, and to the extent that as part of the generator interconnection process or the TPP, the subscriber PTO has to upgrade their line, then they will be allowed to develop a transmission revenue requirement and incorporate that into the ISS access charge. The maximum import capability will be allocated to new scheduling points. That's going to be given to the load serving entities. The current MIC allocation will be given priority over the existing, and an applicant participating TO. The subscriber PTO will be required to execute an applicant participating TO agreement so that we can bridge the time frame between when they apply to be a subscriber PTO and get into the TPP and actually execute the transmission control agreement. So other than the schedule, which is next, I see we've got 2 questions. Michelle, if you could open the line for Joanne Bradley.
Hi, Deb. This is Joanne Bradley with LS Power. Can you hear me okay?
I can. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. How are you doing, Deb?
Good.
Good. Okay. I have questions back on slide 16 and how this is going to work. I'm just trying to get it straight in my head. So on slide 16, the generator interconnection piece. So in terms of like the right of first refusal and the additional upgrades being required for deliverability. So for TransOS Express, is this generator interconnection process going to happen like in the next TPP cycle, or is this going to happen in the TPP cycle following when the subscriber PTO notifies the ISO that the project will be built? So I guess in terms of timing, what is your expectation there for TransWest Express?
So for TransWest Express, the process is already underway. They are in different stages of the transmission interconnection process with Pacific Corp, NV Energy, LS Power, and Southern California Edison. So some of the facility assessments, facility impact studies are completed. The system impact studies are coming, or vice versa. The system impact study is done first, then the facility impact study. So those are all in progress at the moment and ongoing. So they are getting the transmission interconnection process is ongoing now. And in essence, with the portfolios that have come in for 2023, 2024, the CPUC has included 1,500 megawatts up to Wyoming, which in essence, they'll have the first right of refusal for that 1,500 megawatts.
Okay, so when you say the right of first refusal for those megawatts, so are you, okay, so is that for the entirety of the SPTO line? Because I mean, the base scenario, like you said, the base portfolio from the CPUC for 23-24 includes the 1,500 megawatts of capacity requirement from Wyoming. So is the right of first refusal, like I'm confused as to what that's going to be applicable to. So it sounded like it would just be for delivery network upgrades or DNUs. Is it going to be for any other aspects of the interconnection?
So the right of first refusal, you're correct, is for the delivery network upgrades.
Okay, and those are going to be who's going to identify those? Because it sounded like the transmission interconnection process was underway with PacifiCorp and NV Energy and all that. Is it going to be an ISO assessment for the DNUs?
Yes, because that will be part of the transmission planning process for 23-24.
Okay. Okay, I think. Okay, so then if they have the right of first refusal for those DNUs, and these DNUs are required for the original generator, the original interconnection, are those, how are those still gonna, even though there's right of first refusal and Transwest Express will, assuming they build it, how will those DNUs be paid for?
So anything in the transmission planning process is paid for by the existing PTOs.
Okay, so this will be paid for existing PTO and incorporated into their TRR.
Correct.
Okay, and
just like
can you help me?
Process project.
So I guess, okay, so these DNUs will be needed for the generation associated with the CPU portfolio. Why are you providing a right of first refusal for, why is the right of first refusal part of the process? Like, what would be the alternative for these DNUs if it was?
The alternative is that they get chosen to be they get chosen as part of the competitive solicitation, and the entire cost is included in the TAC.
Well, isn't the entire cost of it being included in the TAC via the existing PTO's TRR?
No, because the existing PTO's TRR is only paying for any upgrades on the pre-existing CAISO Balancing Authority area. It's not paying for the DC line from Wyoming to Utah, or the 1,500 megawatt, 500 kV AC line from Utah to Nevada to into the loop in of the Harry Allen El Dorado line. All those costs could be, if they didn't come in as a subscriber PTO, because it's now in the portfolio, they could be included as tax costs, access charge costs.
Okay, but if just that portion of the DNUs, that incremental portion of the DNUs associated with the portfolio were to be competitively bid. So you're just trying to...
You can't competitively bid just the DNUs. You'd have to competitively bid the entire project.
Okay, because the DNUs could not be considered greenfield? Is that kind of because they're attached to?
No, you'd need the reliability network upgrades and the delivery network upgrades.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to need to noodle on this a little more, but thank you so much for the clarification step. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Michelle, can you open up Sharon's line again?
Sharon, I'm unmuting your line. Looks like you're trying to unmute it too, so let me try one more time. Okay, you should be good to go, Sharon.
Hey, Deb, this is Sharon Stegner again. I think I wanted to kind of clarify a little bit where the concern might be coming from here on the right of first refusal issue, and what specifically I'm struggling with here is that, and we can follow up on this after the call if it needed to, but if you look at Order 1000A and specifically paragraph 430. And I think that is kind of summarizes where some of these legal issues are, what we're trying to understand. But it says specifically, it talks about when you can add a right of first refusal into the tariff. And it specifically says in paragraph 430, finally, in response to petitioners' concerns over which facilities are selected in a regional transmission plan for purposes of cost allocation, and for which a federal right of first refusal must therefore be eliminated, we clarify that if any cost of a new transmission facility are allocated regionally or outside of a public utility transmission provider's retail distribution territory or footprint, then there can be no federal right of first refusal associated with such transmission facility, except for as provided in this order. And this was in Order 1000A, but it's actually kind of the linchpin of Order 1000 relating to these cost allocation issues. And so I guess maybe I'm trying to understand how this proposal complies with Order 1000A.
John Anders, do you want to attempt that?
Yeah, sure. And I'll certainly follow up. We appreciate that comment, Sharon. But and I'm not the Order 1000 expert here at the ISO, but my understanding is that when we said in this proposal a right of first refusal, so that is not to a transmission project, and whether or not that project is approved through the transmission planning process. Here, what's happening is there's a project being developed outside of the transmission planning process, and then within our transmission planning process, we're generically building delivery network upgrades, as has been talked about here, and then those are being recovered, and that's at the direction or in satisfaction of the direction of the CPUC to procure the 1,500 megawatts of the Wyoming wind. And so what ends up happening here is that we have this transmission project that'll get developed, but it'll only get developed, if it could be, deliverable. So we're connecting the two pieces together in a proposal, and the proposal would be that we would allocate the delivery network upgrades. And maybe we need to talk more about what it means in terms of these rights or whatever, this quote unquote right of first refusal, but that option or right to deliver from Wyoming would go to the subscriber PTO, the subscribers, the off-takers, and all that, as described in the proposal, because that wind in Wyoming would otherwise not make it to the existing CAISO controlled grid, and that facilities in between are being paid for by the subscribers and not by the ISO. So that's the structure. So we think it's a little bit different, but I do have to dig in more to the Order 1000 and that paragraph you described. And we understand what you're suggesting, and we certainly don't want to get sideways with the commission and their landmark orders and all that stuff. So yeah.
And then I guess one kind of clarifying question: do you anticipate that this project would be subject to any sort of alternatives analysis, or would it be subject to Order 890 as well?
Alternatives in what sense?
In terms of transmission alternatives?
Well, it's not in our transmission plan, so it's being developed outside of the plan.
Right. I mean, right. I see what you're saying. What Order 1000 drills down on in this paragraph I was referring to it's less about is it in the plan or not in the plan. The question is who's paying for it and
Okay,
how those
so-
costs are. And when you get into it gets into the issue of allocation of those costs.
Yeah.
But I think that there's probably just some more legal analysis that's needed. This morning I was looking at all this, and there's at least 20 to 30 different paragraphs in Order 1000 and Order 1000A that probably needs to be, just looked at. But I think that this paragraph 430 is particularly important. But thank you.
No, that's helpful. We appreciate that. And our view, at least at this point, is that, the facilities, the Transwest facilities are not approved in the ISO plan and are also being paid for by the subscribers, so through the off-takers and not through the CAISO's, regional rates or whatever. Clearly the TPP upgrades, and as proposed to meet those portfolio requirements, those would be through the MDR, through the ISO's transmission plan. So, yes. So, thank you.
Right. And I think that one thing that's very important about Order 1000A is that when it made this clarification is that, so essentially what Burke said, if there's any cost that are being paid for, between essentially 2 or more retail distribution service territories, then that triggers it. So if you have a situation where it's not, it would have to be 100% of it is paid for by the subscribers.
Yeah, no, we hear you on that point, and I think at this point, like I said, I think we still see them as two independent pieces. But I hear what you're suggesting, that if we do connect the two together with a right of some kind, then there perhaps could be some questions about how that's compliant with Order 1000. Yeah, no, I get what you're suggesting. So we will follow up as well, and we appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Okay, any other questions or anything in the chat?
No, nothing in the chat.
Okay, all right, next slide, please.
No questions on the audio queue either.
Perfect. Okay, so our schedule at this point is today's stakeholder conference call. Comments are due in 2 weeks, which is June 5th, and we're looking to publish the final proposal and draft tariff language on June 22nd, holding a stakeholder conference call on June 29th, and then allowing you additional time to provide comments on the draft tariff language until the 19th. So the comments that are due on the 5th are only for the draft final proposal. The draft tariff language will be on 7/19. And then we're looking to go to the Board of Governors meeting on July 20th. So we'll have a stakeholder meeting on the tariff language after that point in time. The tariff language is not needed for board approval. And with that, I'll turn it back to Caitlin for next steps.
All right, thank you, Deb. Next slide, please. As Deb mentioned, comments will be due June 5th. You can submit your comments through the commenting tool. Sorry, please disregard the initiative comments. Okay, so we'll have it posted on the policy webpage, which is that second link there. You can access the commenting tool hopefully by the end of today. If you do have any questions or issues with the commenting tool or anything related to today's call, you can send an email to isostakeholderaffairs@caiso.com. Next slide, please. And then we encourage you to check out the Energy Matters blog. We just wanted to share that we posted our latest blog on the 2023 Summer Loads and Resources Assessment. So you can access that through the link provided in the PowerPoint. So with that, thank you again, Deb, for walking us through the revised draft final proposal. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and we look forward to your comments on June 5th. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.